Hi, this video is part of an ongoing experimentation with the formats of bonus content for The Glenn Show. We're releasing it now for the paying subscribers at glennloury.substack.com, and if it's received well, we'll make it available to the general public in a few weeks. In this installment, my editor, Mark Sussman, brought up the topic of effective altruism and long-termism for us to discuss. We taped this before the scandal surrounding the blockchain billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried, who is a proponent of effective altruism and his now imploded company, FTX. You will hear Mark refer to him as a Bitcoin billionaire that figured out some arbitrage scheme that netted him a truly insane amount of money. And you'll also hear Mark foreshadow the scandal by saying, referring to SBF and his kind, quote, "You may be actively participating in the creation of the very structural inequalities that you are, perhaps ought to be, committed to undoing. Are you ever going to produce enough to outpace by the rate of your donations the rate with which you are strengthening the system that you are participating in?" But there's much more to this conversation. I hope you will enjoy it.
So I'd sent this to you a while ago, and Nikita, which was a Twitter thread that I just kind of stumbled on a while ago. We'll link to it in the notes, by someone named Emil P. Torres. I don't know who this person is. Apparently they're writing a book about this, but it concerned effective altruism and something called long-termism. And this Twitter thread is a kind of critique of a certain trend in effective altruism. So just like basically, effective altruism always seemed to me to be a pretty intuitively comprehensible way of thinking about philanthropy, right? And it basically says, okay, if I have this amount of money that I can give, what is the most good I can do with this money? Now, I may feel good about like donating it to a homeless shelter in my neighborhood or something, and surely that's a good cause, or a food bank or something like that. But am I doing the most good with that money? And one of the philosophical kind of influences on this idea was an influential essay by the philosopher Peter Singer, and it kind of invents this now famous thought experiment, which is, so let's say that you're walking along, you're wearing like a really nice silk, I'm paraphrasing, like a really nice suit, and you see, as you're passing a pond, a child drowning in the middle of the pond. And you're a good swimmer, and you know that you can make it to that child in time to rescue the child. Do you do it, even though you know it'll ruin your nice clothes? Almost anybody would say yes. And now Singer's question is like, okay, well then basically what we've done is we've drawn this kind of equation where we said, well, the money that I spent on the suit is worth spending essentially in order to save the life of this child. So he asked, why should we be more willing to do that for a child who is in our immediate proximity than we would be for somebody who is suffering or dying somewhere that is very far away from us that we might not know? What's the difference in the way we're weighing those people's lives? And it kind of proceeds from there to say, like, well, if proximity doesn't really matter, it isn't really a moral concern, if everybody's life is worth the same as everybody else's, if everybody's suffering is the same as everybody else's, then we need to think on a broader scale in terms of how we are expending our resources. Oh, we lost Glenn.
Yeah, I'm back. My internet is a little unstable here, and I got disconnected. You were just explaining, you say Peter Singer had an important article. He gave a thought experiment. A man in a very good suit is willing to spin the suit in order to save the child drowning in the river, but apparently, I infer, not willing to make the same gift on behalf of a child who is unknown to him somewhere in another country or whatever.
Right. Well, that's the question, right? That's the proposition, which is to say, like, well, there's no difference between the life of that child in the pond and the life of another child somewhere else that you just happen not to know, right? I mean, I guess I would ask what you think of this proposition so far.
I don't know what the proposition is. What's the proposition?
Well, the idea that if you're willing to spend whatever X money or lose X amount of money in order to save this one child's life, why would it matter where the child is? Wouldn't you then feel the same sense of moral obligation, or oughtn't we, or should we feel the same sense of moral obligation to someone who just happens to not be in our proximity. We know that people are suffering and dying elsewhere. We know that our money could help. Is there a sort of difference in moral consideration between the child that you can see and the one that you can't, the person you can see and the one that you can't? Doesn't seem like there is. How does that affect our obligations to do what we do with our resources?
Okay, well, my immediate reaction is that the whole problem that's being posed here presupposes the fact of philanthropy as the medium by which assistance is given from person to person. And it puts me in the parlor of the fat, privileged, comfortable, self-absorbed giver who has to figure out, how do I do the best? How do I do the best? What's the best way for me to be generous? And if that's the level of our morality, we have people dying from hunger. We have massive war in which slaughter is wholesale. We have stunted lives. We have hopelessness. We have, et cetera. And the level of our philosophy, the level of our moral reflection is what calculus is best employed as an expression of my generosity. I think, okay, I guess we can do that. I mean, we can count those angels on the head of a pin, but let's not congratulate ourselves that we're really being genuinely, thoroughly moral. I think, anyway, that's my first reaction. I know it's probably not going to stand up to scrutiny, but Peter Singer being a significant figure as he is, but that's my first reaction.
Yeah, well, I would say the issue isn't the sort of status of our self-regard. The effective altruists say, like, okay, well, given I have an excess amount of money and spending it may cause me some discomfort, but really not that much, I can still live and be happy. I should use it in order to help someone else who would receive much more benefit from it than I would, to the extent of being able to possibly save their lives. And so they did a bunch of calculation, and they kind of, like, the early sort of consensus was the most effective way you can spend your money. And we're talking about people who, at least early on, don't have a ton of resources. They're not rich people by and large. It would be to buy mosquito nets that are coated in insecticides and send them to areas that are afflicted by malaria.
I see. The bang for the buck. That's the highest bang for the buck.
Yeah. And the buck is very low and the bang is very high. So that's the thing you should do with your money.
Okay, and that sounds like an economics kind of way of approaching the problem. Let's get the highest bang for the buck. We want to save lives. And yeah, I get that. I mean, it makes me think about how we fund research on medical advance in order to cure various diseases. What about hypertension? What about heart disease? What about sickle cell anemia? What you know? And the way we raise that money is through these various, or one of the ways we do it is through these various campaigns to encourage people to make gifts, and victims will be presented in television ads, and relatives, surviving relatives will be trotted before us, and will be, and maybe that's not at all close to a rational way, even if you assume that the people raising the money put every dollar that they can into doing something good with it. Still, it becomes a kind of popularity contest, which is the disease of the day. You know, what about breast cancer? It's killing women, etc. And that always struck me as somewhat irrational. Irrational is a way of allocating those resources.
Right. And also to say, like, well, I only have, let's say, $200 I can afford to give. Is giving $200 to some cancer research fund going to save any lives? Whereas I can be fairly certain that if I spend it some other way, a less glamorous way, a less spectacular way, a way that may affect people that I will never meet in my life, but will nevertheless have a greater impact, isn't that the thing I should be doing with my whatever limited resources?
Okay.
That to me seems like a pretty, if you are someone who thinks about their resources in that way and thinks that that is a moral imperative, that to me seems like pretty intuitive. But what was interesting to me about this thread is that it expanded on the ways in which effective altruism has kind of changed, or certain factions, at least if I'm understanding things correctly, have changed shape. And the journalist Gideon Lewis Krauss covers this in a good piece in the New Yorker, which we'll also link to from earlier this year, which is that people started thinking, well, okay, we all have limited resources, whatever, but if we have more resources, we can donate more money to more effective causes. So maybe the best thing to do is not to sort of scrimp and save and donate what you can, but actually just to go out and earn as much money as possible. And for most people, the best way to do that is to go work in finance.
No, this was my point in my initial response to you, that it makes the ethics of giving into the ground on which we're going to have a moral discussion, as opposed to the structures of the production of the disparities which the giving is meant to address, as the ground where we'll have the moral discussion. So it has the feel to me, and I don't mean to take a cheap shot, as an indulgence. I mean, what I see, and I actually had this experience when I spent the year 2015, 2016 at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral and Social Sciences at Stanford. And my friend Josh Cohen, an estimable philosopher, a student of John Rawls, a very serious man, invited me to a couple of events that the Boston Review magazine was sponsoring in the Bay Area. One of them was at his home. It was very interesting. He even asked me to make some remarks. And the other was at the home of some very well-heeled tech entrepreneurs whom I don't remember their names, but you would know them if I could remember them, who were worth, $1 billion. And, the spectacular home that they had. And everybody's sitting around. And Peter Singer was the guest of a speaker. And he undoubtedly talked about effective altruism, although I don't remember specifically what he said. But that's neither here nor there. You should have been there. You should have seen the scene. I mean, the view from the veranda was spectacular. Okay. The wine was exquisite. And everybody was in rapt attention as the philosopher held forth. And what I thought was Silicon Valley is sloshing in cash. That the gears of the tech economy are churning here, and there's a lot of excess. And I thought this whole event is a consequence of it's a consumer good. This event is a consumer good for wealthy people who can afford to give away $10 million. And, they're entitled to their consumption too. And again, with great respect to Peter Singer, who's an estimable figure in philosophy, I still think, I don't know if I'm really, really doing ethics, if the problematic that I set for myself is how should people with way, way more than they're ever going to be able to spend think about giving it away. But that doesn't make me a socialist. I'm not saying the government should be the one who's deciding it. I'm just a little bit wary. I'm a little bit wary about it.
Right.
And
well, this is part of the critique, and it would go one step further, maybe where you wouldn't be willing to go, which is to say, like, well, okay, these are just like, this is a way for rich people to sort of salve their consciences over the ungodly amounts of money that they make and the unseemly lifestyles that they live. But the step further would be like, not only that, but if you're participating in the financial industry, and the Gideon Lewis Krauss profile, one of the figures it focuses on is this Bitcoin billionaire who figured out some like arbitrage scheme that netted him like a truly insane amount of money. You may be actually actively participating to the creation of the very structural inequalities that you are perhaps ought to be committed to undoing. That is, you can target your donations in X or Y way, but ultimately you have to participate and shore up this system in order to make the money to do that. Are you ever going to be able to outpace by the rate of your donation the rate at which you are strengthening the system that you are participating in? I don't know if anyone's done that calculus. That's an interesting question to me.
No, I get the logic of it. I'm a giver. The world doesn't have that many givers. I'm a giver. The more resources I have, the more giving there will be. Mm-hmm. Therefore, give me more, give me more. I'm not doing it just to be greedy. I'm doing it because, this is effectively one way to get resources to people who need it. And if we relied on politics and government and deliberation and whatnot to create institutional responses to the need, we might be waiting forever. But I'm a giver, and so okay. With respect, I mean, what is there that keeps this conversation from being captured by fad or fancy? I mean, mosquito nets did a lot of good. They saved people from malaria. What about saving the planet from climate change? We'll save all of mankind. We'll save all of humankind. We'll save all of the animal kingdom if we don't allow the atmosphere. So you want bang for the buck? Count the number of saved lives going out millennia from not allowing the temperature of the earth to rise more than 2 degrees centigrade by the turn of the 22nd century.
Mm-hmm.
So now I've got everything I need to fuel my ideological crusade on behalf of this idea that is really a religion. This is the critical posture. New Age, thinking about the relationship between man and the material environment sweeps through us, and speculation, guessing, whatever it, and then that becomes the narrative that guides the thoughtful, I'll put that in inverted commas, the thoughtful philanthropist. And it's, I think Jesus is coming back. I'm gonna put my money in the church. I think Jesus is coming. What's the difference?
Glenn, the way you put it is actually way more quaint than what these guys actually think. And your use, not all of them, again, I want to just sort of make clear that there are disputes within this group. And the use of the term religion is appropriate, I think, because one of the sort of foundational tenets of long-termism, or one of the sort of foundational arguments, is exactly the kind of future-oriented thinking that you're talking about, right? And this comes from the work of a philosopher named Derek Parfit, where he kind of, again, proposes this thought experiment. He says, okay, we have a society in which we're perfectly capable of blowing up all human life on Earth, right? It could happen tomorrow, no one knows. Now, imagine a scenario. There's 3 scenarios. Scenario A is which this doesn't happen and everyone's fine. Scenario B is a situation in which 99% of humanity is eliminated. Scenario C is the scenario in which 100% of humanity is eliminated. There are no more humans. Now, Parfit says obviously A is preferable. It seems like B is preferable over C. We'd rather have 1% of humanity rather than none, but by how much? And he says by way more than 1%, because in giving the ability of humanity to reproduce itself, you are saving future lives, which could be measured if you sort of expand the possible timeline of human existence in the 10 to the 20th to the 30th to the 40th, right? Trillions, hundreds of trillions, whatever comes after trillions, numbers of lives are lives that you could be saving by saving that 1% of humanity. So that's far, 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 far more preferable. Now, this leads people, like I think of the philosopher Nick Bostrom, to start doing some truly, to my mind, bizarre theorizing, which is to say that, the Earth can't support that many people. So it's incumbent upon us to start thinking about how we will eventually live in space colonies elsewhere, because these are potential lives that have to be saved. And he goes on to theorize that human consciousness will be uploaded into some sort of digital simulation. Now, I'm giving way super broad strokes on this, but this is the kind of drift of this thinking, right? And when you do that, the scope within which humanity could live, I don't know, potentially becomes expanded almost infinitely. And all of these lives, these potential future lives, are worthy of the same moral consideration that we give to those currently living. Now, if that's the case,
Well, that's a big step, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think of your fondness for Chicks in Lou's
I
Three
was
Body.
thinking of him.
Yeah.
I was thinking of it because they do actually upload this guy. They freeze his brain and they set it off on a uh, planetary spaceship on the theory that the intelligent beings whom they're interacting with will be able to decipher and reconstruct this person's consciousness, and they in fact are successful at that. And you think about immortality and all that kind of stuff. I don't know how to think about this. I'm not a philosopher by training. Uh, I keep reverting to the politics of now as opposed to trying to take myself out of the give and take, the back and forth of power and inequality, and try to think about it in a broader way. Uh, and I also wonder about the practicality of linking this kind of armchair speculation, which is welcome. I welcome thoughtful people asking hard questions. How to separate that from action, from what it is we do, you know. So I'm at a loss for further comment at this moment.
Well, I mean, step back and think about the initial state of this kind of paradigm, which is that we should figure out how to help people, and the best way to do that is to buy a lot of mosquito nets and send them to places with a lot of malaria because people are dying. If you take us to the point that this line of thinking, one off branch of this line of thinking, is talking about, now we're talking about weighing the sort of well-being of people living on Earth now against who knows how many hypothetical future people. And that's the step that to me is like one of those things where I understand the logic and its sound, that I nevertheless feel really wary of. And then I say, well, am I just being sentimental in thinking that all of this sounds extremely hypothetical and not really that much worth my worry, because there are people who are currently suffering, and if I'm going to give them my money, like if I have money to give, I feel like they should have it because they are currently suffering? Or do I just have a presentist bias in this? Because I would also say that, for example, if I had children or wanted to have children, that I would want the world to be a good place for those children. So I would act then, presumably, in a way that would make the world. Now, that's also a hypothetical future person. So I've already admitted that I am capable of sort of thinking in this future projected way.
I'm sure this is 101 for this branch of philosophy,
Oh,
but
yeah.
the
Yeah.
thought occurs to me. So I discount the future within my own life. In other words, I have to decide about the relative significance of Glenn today and Glenn a year from now and Glenn 5 years. And when I make decisions about saving and investment and all of that, when I invest in my health, when I, how many drinks am I going to have versus how long am I going to live? I'm trading off the pleasure of the moment against the longevity of being alive altogether. And I make these things within myself. And I prefer Glenn today to Glenn 10 years from now, other things equal. If you ask me, do I want the cake now? Or do I want it a week from now or a year from now? I want it now. And if you ask me how much I'm willing to pay to have it now versus it's a non-trivial amount. So I'm kind of a presentist in my own internal self-evaluation. Again, I'm sure I'm not saying anything that people haven't thought about. What about society? What's the difference between an individual who discounts his own or her own future in preference of present experience to future gain, and a society that is inclined to take actions that at the expense of future, like, for example, borrow money that has to be repaid by our grandchildren? Um, uh, so I guess my in intuitive reaction to the underlying premise that every life, every human life, whenever it may present itself, is to be weighed equally, and that there's something ethically problematic about presentism, about putting more weight on the experience of generations now alive than of those as yet to be conceived. That premise, which seems to be at the root of all of this, I'm questioning. I don't know if it's right. I mean, let's do another thought experiment. Suppose we were in 1850. That was 172 years ago. And there was something that we could do that would produce a benefit for the future of 10 for every person who would be alive at the cost of 1 for every person alive in 1850. If we took that resource from them and did something with it, the future benefits, plant trees, whatever. There was some kind of time machine thing where we could deprive people in 1850 of a little bit of their well-being on behalf of increasing the well-being of many, many more people 172 years later. Will we do it? Well, we live 2.5 times longer than people who were alive in 1850. We get on airplanes and we fly across great oceans, and people in 1850 couldn't have even conceived of that. We have a library in our pocket with instant access to everything that's been written or known in the human experience, practically in our pockets. People in 1850 couldn't have even begun to conceive of that. Why should they have given up anything, epsilon, anything, on behalf of improving the lives of those who have come after? Now, how do I know that there won't be telepathic, teletransporting, immortal beings walking on the planet in 300 or 500 or 1,000 years? They are likely to be much more masters of the universe than we could. That's an inside joke between me and Mark. Than we could ever imagine ourselves being. Let me get, I mean, this is just the guy that drives a truck's answer to you. Let me get from here to tomorrow. Can we please just take care of what's right in front of our nose? Something like that.
Well, I mean, the easy response to the last thing is to say, like, we know that we do things on different scales to not just take care of what's right in front of our nose. Because when you're talking about that kind of problem, what's in front of our nose is actually a problem about the future, right? How to fix inflation is a problem about the future. It's not a problem about literally today. It's a problem about the next 6 months, the next year, et cetera, et cetera. So you're already in the sort of realm of futurity when you're talking about this stuff. It's not a fair question to say, like, well, should we expect someone in 1850 to sacrifice X amount so that we can benefit by it 10X? Because we already know that we're here. We already know that we're alive. So, like, of course I would say, yes, you should do that because I'm alive and I want what you've got, or I think that we could all benefit by what you've got. Now, the question is not are people going to be around 150 years from now? I feel pretty confident in saying that they will. I mean, I guess there could be a nuclear apocalypse. But whether, like you say, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years hence, that's a different kind of question because we don't know the answer to that question, right? Should you plant a tree now knowing that in 50 years it will do good? I mean, yes, you should, because it's a reasonable proposition that we will be here 50 years hence. But should we make the kind of near-term sacrifices or decisions? I won't say sacrifices necessarily, because it's not clear to me that the Bitcoin billionaire who spends his money on effective altruist things is making any kind of sacrifice. Although I should say that particular person I'm referring to does live a kind of Spartan lifestyle where they
Who is that? I'm sorry again.
Who's the person from the Ian Lewis Krauss article who made that money through Bitcoin arbitrage and is using it for effective altruist causes. But I'll say another thing about what this guy is doing, which is that some of that money via a foundation went to support an effective altruist candidate at the local level in Oregon who is running on explicit EA principles. Now, I don't think you want, but it does open the door to a whole different kind of question, which is to what extent, when you start directing that amount of money in service of a moral idea, does it no longer become a moral idea, but in fact a political idea?
It was a political idea from day one, if you ask me.
Could you say more about that?
Whether or not it was explicitly undertaken as an act of politics, it was always political, in that the institution of private property and the structural protections of the prerogatives of individuals who accumulate large amounts of wealth rests on a political foundation. The state can come and take your property. You don't have to be allowed to walk away from your financial trades with 100% of what you earned. You could walk away with 5% of what you earned. And the commissars could take the other 95%. Of course, then nobody would be earning anything. I grant you that. I'm not arguing, but I'm saying it's political. But I think you raise a question: a candidate runs for office, and so then does a movement perhaps get underway? And maybe the movement has cultural influence and not just political influence. And presentism becoming something like ableism, a thing that everybody shuns. They don't want to be called an ableist. You don't want to be called a presentist. Not everybody has got the luxury. I mean, this is luxury, isn't it? Many people are set upon by the weight of their current circumstance, and and yet, to the extent that those ideas permeate into the culture and become widespread normative guides to political action, they will affect what governments do and how programs are developed and so forth and so on. So,
I hadn't considered that the idea that like presentism would become like a sort of accusation that you could level against somebody that would carry the same, that you could be canceled for presentism, right? It would be so beyond. I mean, just thinking about this, it's impossible to imagine, because it just requires too much of people to ever itself become something that would become a compelling political idea on the scale necessary to enact that kind of change.
Easily see that.
Really?
Yeah. With how culture has changed in the last 30 years, nobody expected transgender rights to be the thing that it is today. If that idea elevated so much, why can't this one?
Well, because it's linked to identity, and this sort of the imaginary presentist slur is something that is explicitly delinked from individual identity, unless being a presentist, right, with this sort of essentialist notion that implies, right, becomes the real problem. Like, so if I say if I use, like, whatever, a racial slur, the problem is not that I said something wrong. The problem is that I am a racist, right? That's what the problem becomes.
Yeah, but like if you don't buy into the climate change proposition, you're then a climate change denier that becomes a noun and becomes an identity imposed on you. And that presentism thing it would be tied to climate change denialism, and then a bunch of other propositions about the future.
Okay, let's take a couple of issues. Abortion. Factor abortion through this lens. I'm not saying anything concrete about it. I'm just saying it's a target-rich environment. Thinking about the future, thinking about lives, etc. And what about colonialism? Let's wind the clock back and think about the ethical problem of the encounter between civilizations where there's a substantial technological, guns, germs, and steel, substantial technological disparity. I'm not sure how to weigh preserving old ways of life. You're a native indigenous population. This is how you've done healthcare. This is how you've organized your family. this, whatever. You don't know the modern world. These are your children. You're passing on your culture to them. What's the value of introducing modernity, even though it would destroy the traditions, et cetera, et cetera? Preservationism.
You are skipping over a major issue, which is self-determination, agency, death, right?
Yeah, you're right. I wasn't considering them, but that's kind of making my point. I was only saying the ethics of present versus future and the weighing of those equities has to be filtered through, political and cultural and other filters before we come to a firm conclusion about that.
We're one to do that. You might have a kind of interesting philosophical question, but we all know that's not the question that was being asked in the case of colonialism. It wasn't really, can we make these people's lives better?
No, I don't mean to be misunderstood. Mine is a retrospective, anachronistic thought experiment. I'm saying take the ethical sensibility reflected in this debate about long-termism, take it back to the ethical dilemma confronting somebody at a particular point in time, and how would you think about it?
Right. What could we use to justify, if this was the paradigm from which we were operating, how would it change the way we talk and think and maybe justify X, Y, or Z proposition? I mean, if used carelessly, you can use it to justify anything, of course.
Can I throw in one weird thing? It just occurred to me as you were telling the story of long-termism that one of the offshoots of it corresponds to a peculiar Russian philosopher from the 19th century, Nikolai Fyodorov, who had this idea that it sounds ridiculous to me, but in how ridiculous it sounds, it also...
Hi, how are you? We're just concluding the preceding meeting. I want to introduce you to Nikita and to Mark.
The future is impinging upon the present.
We should put a time limit on this, shouldn't we?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's true.
Let me just finish this one thing, because I want to share it with you just because I think you'll laugh. So there's this idea from this guy from the 19th century who was a religious thinker, but also kind of science fiction-y in his style. And he had this turn of thought that I found poetically beautiful, and then I can't even approach it on any kind of intellectual level. And the idea was that he thought that humans will technologically develop a way to be immortal. He thought this is just like science leads to that, and probably fairly soon. And then he said that if this generation of people who gained immortality do not make it their first and the most important priority to resurrect all of the previous generations and give immortality to them, then this generation isn't like morally worth the gift of immortality. This is humanity lost. If they don't do that, these are completely arrogant, selfish souls. They're already like in the realm of hell by how they approach life. And it's like, it's almost, only when you talked about transhumanism and long-termism, I realized that this is like basically the same thing, but the arrow is pointed not into the future, but into the past.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there would be a response to that, which we don't have to get into, which is like, of course, if you expend the resources necessary to raise the dead and make them immortal, you may be sacrificing long-term gains in humanity that could be measured in the tens to tens to tens. But we don't have to do that. I want to make clear that I do not subscribe to long-termism as a...
And I want to mention my former student, Philip Trammell, a brilliant Brown undergraduate who did economics and math, and who went off to, I think it's Cambridge. He's working with these, is it Cambridge? Is that the place where there's this hotbed of technical philosophy? There's a school. It's Cambridge or yes. Oxford, or
I can't remember. It's one of them. Yeah,
maybe it's University College London. Anyway, he's in their midst. And Philip, if you should ever hear this, I haven't, because he came to me. He happened to be coming through Providence, and he came by to just say hi. And he was talking about all this stuff about valuing lives, in the very, very, very far future, and there's some mathematical, technical kind of issues in the theory of social choice that get raised by this way of thinking that he's working on. He's doing a PhD in philosophy.
Wow.
Anyway, yeah, long-termism.
Yeah. So we've got to go. You've got to
Yeah.
get scheduled right now. So anyway, this is great. Thanks.
Okay,
for
so we're talking on Monday at 5:30.